and my team members. My name is Tom Purical. I am the program director on SHARE, which stands for Supporting Holistic and Actionable Research in Education. This is a cooperative agreement with USAID's Center for Education, and it is made to the University of Notre Dame, and I specifically work within the Pulte Institute for Global Development at the University of Notre Dame. I'm joined today by our Associate Technical Director, Nancy Ryberg, and Andrea McMurdy-Bremer, who is our Associate Director, also working on SHARE. Just to confirm and make sure that everybody's on the right call, this is the call for SHARE's small grants mechanism, which we have opened up for existing USAID implemented projects and partners who are working on those projects. So if you are not within that category and not currently implementing a USAID education intervention and working for another organization that's implementing a USAID, that's implementing an education intervention, then I would invite you to join us tomorrow at the same time on the same channel, which is relevant for non-USAID funded projects. So with that, we'll get started. Today, we expect to cover a brief overview on SHARE, review a little bit around USAID's learning agendas and our process for identifying exactly the questions that we'll be focusing on. We'll review the questions themselves and then go into more specifics around the actual application process, eligibility details, and then save the majority of the time for any questions and answers. Great. So in terms of SHARE, as I mentioned, SHARE stands for Supporting Holistic and Actionable Research in Education. We are the USAID Center for Education's principal mechanism for doing primary research. Our first outcome is to carry out that research specifically to advance USAID's learning priorities within the education sector. But a lot of that is also related to how we do our work, which is reflected in outcome number 2, where we intentionally try to connect the research that we're doing to those who will ultimately be using the research and decision makers, as well as practitioners. So throughout the research process, we do incorporate steps where we bring together research generators, translators, and users to contribute to the research design, help us note and clarify and confirm the research questions, and contribute to the process overall, and then ultimately help to validate findings and share out recommendations that would be relevant both for the sector as well as for individual organizations. And then the third outcome ties to providing specialized technical assistance to USAID bureaus and missions to help address their specific technical needs related to education. We can find most of the questions we're working on, well, actually all of the questions we're working on are reflected within USAID's learning agendas. There are, for those who are not aware, the Center for Education currently works through 4 principal learning agendas. The first one focused on foundational skills development, a second one on youth workforce development, a third on higher education, and then the fourth on education in crisis and conflict. So these are currently their 4 learning agendas, and 2 of the learning agendas, the foundational skills development and education in crisis and conflict, were just revised this year. SHARE played a large role in helping to manage that revision process. The other two learning agendas are fairly recent and or completed more recently, and so are or reflect kind of more of a current state of where those are at the moment. So you'll note that the questions that we pull from will be coming from these learning agendas. Great. So I do want to review the questions themselves, which were reflected within the RFA. The first one being the first two coming from the foundational skills development learning agenda, the next two coming from the education and crisis and conflict learning agenda. And I might ask my colleague, Nancy, if she can clarify any of this, if there are any questions, and maybe provide a little bit of context around the questions as well. But I'll go ahead and read the questions. The first one focuses on in-service educators and really their professional development. So what in-service educator professional development modalities cost effectively and sustainably improve educator performance and student learning outcomes, including for children with disabilities, and what combination of modalities and approaches lead to these outcomes. The second question is, what are effective approaches and tools for identifying and supporting the access, inclusion, and learning of all children and youth, particularly those from marginalized groups? The first education crisis and conflict question is, what are effective approaches and tools for identifying and supporting the access, inclusion, and learning of all children and youth, particularly those from marginalized groups? And the second EICC question is, what works to promote whole learner well-being for learners from different demographic groups? What initiatives advance children's social emotional learning? And what is the relationship between socio-emotional learning and academic outcomes? Nancy, did you want to speak to any of those questions maybe before we move to the next set?
Just to say that they were put together with a broad array of stakeholders from around the globe, and we had a survey that went out to get priority topics, and then kind of collaborated on some regional workshops to unpack those topics a bit more. And then they were prioritized further by USAID missions, indicating that these are some of the key areas of interest in the countries where USAID works. But also, just to say, we know there's been a lot of research on educator professional development, but so for the first question, getting a sense of how to implement those effectively across a variety of contexts, what are the most cost-effective ways to use what have been proven to be evidence-based practices, are continuing challenges, and then certainly educator professional development approaches that can be taken up by government and sustainably kind of implemented across time is also an interest and a gap in the field. And then any research project, I would say that like these are very broad learning agenda questions. They're not research questions, so we would expect that research would kind of narrow a bit from these. But yeah, I think the main thing is we know there's a lot of research on educator professional development, but there are some gaps in terms of like how to implement it effectively. What are some cost-effective ways to do so? I think that is kind of the biggest one to pull out. But maybe if there are other questions from folks afterward, we can think about those as well. Over.
Great. Thanks very much, Nancy. And then the next set of questions, two focused on higher education. The first is, how can the viability and effectiveness of online and other forms of distance education be improved? The second higher education question, how can higher education access, retention, and completion rates be improved for underrepresented populations, especially women, Indigenous and marginalized populations, and people with disabilities? And then the youth workforce development question that we would be focusing on is, how does dosage and modality of soft skills training affect skills acquisition and employment outcomes are less costly, scalable forms of soft skills support, comparably effective to intensive forms of support. The principal research mechanism or research approach that we're looking for these small grants is implementation research, which is why we ask that they be linked to existing activities and interventions and projects where we can really focus on areas for improving or modifying implementation so that we can test the actual concepts and get a better sense of ultimately if the concepts are working. And some of the questions that we'd be looking for specifically would be thinking about whether or not these interventions work, but more in particular, in what context they work, who they work for, and if they can be scaled up. So when we look at questions around context, we would be looking at themes related to either the feasibility of the interventions or their appropriateness and in what context they would be appropriate. Looking in terms of its stakeholders, who they would work for, the overall acceptability of the interventions, and who would be adopting them and how they're adopted. And then intervention delivery, ultimately looking at questions related to fidelity, delivery modalities, cost, especially when we think about scaling, and equity. Nancy, did you want to say anything more potentially about these?
Sure. Just to say that, these are kind of this is an overarching framework that we are using for the implementation research. And the idea is that there are a lot of great evidence-based interventions out there, but we need to adapt them to new contexts. And so one of the goals of this research is to get a sense of, well, what adaptations for the context part, what adaptations might be needed to feasibly carry out this intervention in a new context, and or learning about the appropriateness of the intervention for that context. So I guess kind of to take away from this, the goal is that implementers would be able to kind of use the research to iteratively improve the intervention implementation efforts. So potentially some tweaks to the design, but then also to the implementation processes as you're gathering information. You can make changes to enhance the feasibility, or you can collect data to see, well, how acceptable is the change that we're trying to carry out to the key stakeholders that we're working with, and then make some adaptations based on that. So just as a classic implementation research paradigm, the whole point is that these are some of the areas of inquiry that you can use to improve your implementation and your intervention. Over.
Excellent. Thanks, Nancy. And with this, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Andrea, to go through details specifically related to the small grants mechanism.
Thanks, Tom. And I would just like to invite people, if you do have questions as we're going, please feel free to put them in the chat. They may be things that we'll address as we go through the remainder of the webcast, but we will make sure to sort of triage questions as we go and at the question and answer at the end. So please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. So as Tom said at the beginning of the webcast, this today is about our Track 1 grants, and these are for current implementers of USAID-funded education projects. The fund size for this Track 1 is $500,000, and we anticipate that we'll be awarding 4 awards up to $125,000 each under this Track 1 of our small grants mechanism. The application is currently open and on our website, and the application date for submission is the 15th of this month at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the US. We expect, again, these awards to be up to $125,000 and a duration of implementation of these implementation research projects of 8 to 12 months. The type of award will be in both financial support and in technical support from SHARE, and we'll be issuing, as I said, up to 4 of these awards. The objectives of this small grant mechanism is to fund and support more evidence generation and use, and to improve this and scale USAID's current education projects in line with their learning agendas. As Tom said, we do have questions under each of the 4 learning agendas for the Center for Education, and we want to understand within the context of these interventions what's working, who's it working for, and in what context. How are these interventions working, and at what cost to implement these interventions? And we really hope that the evidence coming out of the small grants mechanism will contribute to changing practice for evidence-based continuous improvement across all the global education sectors. Who can apply for this round? So as we've said, track 1 is for current USAID-funded education implementing organizations. And we are looking for these partners to be those who have the potential to generate and use evidence within their current implementations to learn, adapt, and improve upon the current work that they are doing in the field. These existing education projects should be implementing an evidence-based model. So interventions that have already been designed based on evidence, but may need additional evidence for their particular context or the specific type of implementation that is underway. These projects should also be integrating into the education evidence ecosystems within their context, involving different stakeholders, including those who generate evidence, translate evidence, and ultimately those who use evidence and use research for decision-making, whether it be policy or programmatic decision-making. These interventions should actively engage with communities of practice that are working within their study area. These can be from the government, donors of other bilateral organizations, other practitioner organizations, and these communities of practice can help to inform the research design and ultimately facilitate the uptake of learnings coming from these studies. And lastly, these education projects should be considering either scaling up or hand over to host governments at the end of intervention. So generating evidence that can help to continue to adapt these interventions and then be ready for scale or government uptake within their context. The eligibility criteria for track 1 is that the proposed research should be focused on improving an ongoing education project that is centered around one of the USAID priority learning areas that Tom addressed across foundational skills, education in crisis and conflict, higher education, or youth workforce and development. While we understand that some interventions may address multiple of the prioritized research questions, we ask that applications be limited to 1 project per submission and 1 research question or 1 learning agenda question per submission. An additional eligibility criteria is that the entity that is leading and implementing the research and the education intervention must be currently receiving funding from USAID and have an active unique entity identifier, or UEI, in the SAM.gov system. The project also needs to be at a place in its timeline where it can still adapt its implementation based on the findings from this research. So we ask that projects that are submitting applications not be at the end of implementation and moving into closeout. There needs to be time to continue to adapt the intervention. And then, as mentioned, the proposed research will run for 8 to 12 months. And so that needs to fit in to the timeline of the project implementation. Each of the grants that are issued under this small grant mechanism will be up to $125,000 per award. And in conjunction with SHARE, a right fit of technical assistance will be determined for the course of the 8 to 12-month implementation. These grants will be applied to assist with learning needs related to key implementation factors, such as perceptions of key stakeholders, the intervention reform and delivery modalities, and again, in context in line with priorities cited within the prioritized learning agenda questions. The right fit technical assistance from SHARE can take on many different forms, but it is designed to enhance the efficiency, the adaptability, and the application of the evidence that will be generated through these small grant implementation research projects. This technical assistance can include, but is not limited to, help from SHARE to investigate issues and co-create a research design to test different options, offer a light touch support of the applicant's internal research team, so supporting the MEL team or other research team within your organization that will be conducting the research, and then ultimately sharing the ecosystem engagement approach that has been designed through SHARE that will help to engage with local key stakeholders and increase the possibility of uptake of this evidence, not only within the implementation of the intervention, but also other local stakeholders, most importantly, in including local government. The application for the Track 1 small grant mechanism is first, stage 1, the submission of an application form. All of the forms and annexes for the application can be found on our website. But it is the submission of a 2-page maximum application, which is Annex 1 of the RFA, the submission of a summary budget, a work plan for the implementation research, and a budget narrative. Additional documentation that will be required is the current monitoring and evaluation plan of the education intervention, as well as the current work plan for the intervention under study. As noted, the submission for application deadline is 5 p.m. United States Eastern Time, July 15th, so 2 weeks. Stage 2 of the application process is our co-creation process. All applications will go through an initial screening, and those that qualify for the initial shortlist will be scheduled a 90-minute co-creation call with the SHARE team. This call will be to discuss the application and for the applicant to respond to any clarifying questions that may be aligned with the evaluation criterion. The evaluation criterion are available in the RFA, and these will guide the co-creation call. And then the last step of the process would be the final determination. SHARE will then determine from the shortlisted candidates up to four grants to move forward. And we will be looking to balance these studies across the different various learning agenda areas and looking for opportunities for these implementation research projects to collaborate with other similar ongoing research that may allow for even more robust studies than these individual implementation research studies that will be funded through the small grant. The timeline for the application process is, again, the submission deadline of July 15th. Between July 16th and August 7th, the SHARE team will be reviewing the initial applications and generating a short list of candidates to move forward into the co-creation process. Co-creation calls will be scheduled between August 14th and 16th. And again, these will be 90-minute calls with the SHARE team. And then by August 20th, SHARE will select the final portfolio of 4 grants to award and move forward into implementation. With that, I think there may have been at least one question in the chat, but if there are any questions or additional comments from my colleagues, I will turn it back over to Tom.
Great. Thanks very much, Andrea. I answered Rachel's question already in the chat. If there are other questions, please feel free to either voice them or include them in the chat now.
Yes, this is Lauren McCaskill from School to School International. I had a question about, well, thank you also for this really clear presentation. I had a question about one detail that's in the RFA about that Share expects that these research projects will mostly be implemented within the infrastructure of the ongoing USAID project. So I was wondering if there's any information you might be able to provide in terms of the appetite for what types of things you are willing to fund through this, or what types of things you would assume the project would cover.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a good question, Lauren. So, I mean, certainly if we can appreciate that there might be additional labor costs associated with the research, other costs that could surround transportation, particularly related to data collection. I think the hope is that if they're paired, because they all these would be paired with an existing project, that it could minimize the cost of bringing on new staff, specifically just for the research and having to create a specific kind of a project team that would just focus on this, that would be independent of the research. So really just looking for opportunities to save costs so that as much of the resources can be dedicated to doing a robust study, and then allowing enough time for analysis and but just making sure that we're being efficient with the resources by being able to leverage as much as the existing team that exists. Um, so yeah, so just in short, labor, any transportation costs, convenings for potential actors, really that would be related to the study itself, and just keeping at a minimum anything else that might kind of otherwise need to be incurred if this is just kind of an independent study. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Great. And I see a question from Rachel for the management capacity. The call states, be prepared to name a principal investigator and team that will oversee the research activities, in almost all cases drawing from the implementation team. Did the PI have to be from the implementation team, or can it be someone else from within the implementing organization? And the answer to that question, Rachel, is yes, it can definitely be somebody from outside of the implementation team, and some within the organization. We anticipate, for example, that sometimes the PIs might be headquarters based, and so might not be on the ground. We do ask that at least some members of the team be located in country or on site where the research is going to be taking place, just to make sure that it is properly contextualized and able to link to actors on the ground, both to inform the research design and process, as well as to help with uptake later on. But the PI can be from within the organization outside of the immediate project. And did I see a hand up from Sam? Yeah.
So apologies if this is something that is kind of clearly articulated in the RFA, but would you mind saying a few words about the role of the USAID funding team that's kind of supporting the implementation of whatever the project is?
Sure. Yeah. So we would be working with them primarily, mostly to gain concurrence if need be. They would be one of the actors who ideally would be engaged in helping to inform the design process, and would then be also then involved in kind of the findings and the results phase as well. We'd want to keep their engagement light. We understand that this can be kind of a burdensome process, for some missions, and we don't want that to be a reason for not going through with the research. But we also would very much value any kind of any perspective and input coming from their side. There are going to be questions that the USAID team on the ground would potentially want to know, and that would be revealed during the research design process. There'll be other questions that would be more specific to the implementing partner and help to inform some of their implementation practices without necessarily needing to report everything to USAID. And we would want to allow for that opportunity for trust building and relationship building between our team and their team if needed. So that's why during the research process, we would want to be very clear on what questions pertain to which stakeholders and actors, and make sure that that's clearly defined, that process. Does that answer your question, Sam?
Yeah, thank you. That's fair.
Great. Any other questions? Oh, go ahead, Nancy.
Just to add to that, Sam, we know that one of the main goals for implementation research is for the implementer themselves, and you all are kind of the key users of the research, and so a lot of the research may be just for your internal use to improve your own practices. But we also have this other component of the criteria where we're talking about this kind of jargon of the ecosystem engagement, and it is basically those key actors that you're engaging with as you're carrying out the work. So depending on the intervention, it may be like a Ministry of Education actor or the mission and others. And it's just to the extent that your research can be useful to that broader community of practice, that you're engaging with them as you're thinking through the design and sharing out findings and those sorts of things. That's something that we would love to hear you all speak to in the application, and then that would be kind of part of the process as well, just your contribution to what we're calling is the ecosystem, but it's that broader community of practice that's working on that topic of study. So it might be educator professional development or youth workforce soft skills development, etc. Over.
And I just wanted to note that I don't know if all of you have had an opportunity to go through the request for applications and the application template in particular. We are hoping to make this application a light lift for organizations. We can appreciate you have a lot of work going on with your current implementation, and we're interested in engaging in research and providing resources to help you study your implementation even more. So we are asking that applications be limited to no more than 2 pages, just a summary budget at this point, and a kind of indicative work plan on what the research would look like, as well as submitting documents related to your current implementation, whether it be a timeline or work plan and your AMELP. So hopefully that'll be helpful as you work on these applications and not be overly time consuming.
I had one more question on, it sounded like from the language that you're using at the beginning of the webinar that this would be acceptable, but I just wanted to ask explicitly if an organization is a sub-recipient or subcontractor on a USAID-funded education project and they've, talked with their prime about this opportunity, would you also be accepting applications from organizations like that and not only prime implementers?
Yes, I think part of there's a separate mechanism for locally registered organizations or organizations that are locally registered in the implementing countries. So we would reserve that mechanism for some of the other partners that you might be working with who are local organizations. If it's a US-based institution or organization that is benefiting from and working with the USAID Prime, we can consider that. Ideally, we would be working with the primes more for the sake of the management support. These are supposed to provide funding for existing projects to move forward some kind of study based on their current implementation, and with kind of limited management support possibly from our side, although technical support would be made available. But that said, if we can certainly consider situations where you might be a sub to another prime, and at least at the same time you are a US-based organization, we would require that you have a UEI already and already able to receive USAID funds through a US government mechanism already, right? So.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions? Great. With that, we'll conclude this webcast. Thanks to all of you for participating today. As we noted at the beginning, we will put a copy of this recording on our website for others to access within your organizations, or if you would like to circulate this, feel free to do so. And we look forward to receiving applications from you. Thanks very much, Rachel. Thanks, Sam. And thank you, Lauren. Thanks, Michaela.